Well, good morning and welcome to the 2021 Asia Briefing Live Forum. My name is Stuart Fuller and I'm the Chairman of the Asia Society Australia and the Global Head of Legal Services at KPMG. I'm delighted to open this year's forum and to introduce our first panel, which is Australia Reopened. 2021 marks the 4th anniversary of Asia Briefing Live, and we're happy to announce that the response to this year's forum has been overwhelming with over 650 registrations. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Diplomatic Corps and the Australian ambassadors in the region who are amongst our audience today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently speaking to you from Kirribilli in Sydney on the land of the Cammeraygal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people who are joining our forum today. I'd also encourage you to watch our full Welcome to Country delivered from Melbourne by Wurundjeri Elder Uncle Colin Hunter, which is accessible on our forum platform. You'll also find a welcome message from our CEO, Philip Ivanov, and a welcome address from Minister Jala Pulford. As you'll probably know by now, the theme of this year's event is Rethink, Recovery, Renewal. In 2021, the ongoing pandemic continues to play havoc across the global economy, challenges democratic ideals and values, and threatens the current geopolitical order. And despite ramping up its vaccination campaign, Australia will need time before it can reopen its economy to the world. After more than 18 months in the form of isolation, it is critical to discuss, assess, and implement strategies to connect with the region whilst we continue to protect public health. So today we'll explore how our economy can stay connected to Asia in the future and how Australia can continue to engage with the region despite these border challenges. So it's my absolute pleasure now to introduce our star panel to open our forum today. We have Chris Andrews, the Deputy CEO and Chief Investment Officer of Trobe Financial, Matt Bekier, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of The Star, Sally Capp, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Raina MacIntyre, Professor of Global Biosecurity and National Health and Medical Research Council Principal Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales, and Mark Scott, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. And this session is going to be moderated by the incredible Haidi Stroud-Watts, anchor at Bloomberg. We have quite a busy day for you today, and I encourage you to explore our agenda along with the information on our speakers in the menu on the left-hand side of your screen. If you toggle between the two and click on our speakers' headshots, you'll be able to read their full bios. I'd also encourage you to stay to the end of our forum today in our keynote address by Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, the Singapore Minister for Foreign Affairs, on the state and impact of the COVID pandemic in Southeast Asia, the priorities for recovery, and Singapore's perspectives on the geopolitical and economic trends and tensions. It'll be a fantastic session. Throughout the day, you can also explore our interactive platform and look at all of its features, including the live polling that we'll conduct, Q&A, and networking with other attendees via LinkedIn. And while you're listening into today's forum, you can also learn more about the Asia Society's current projects, including our Disruptive Asia series and the upcoming Melbourne Asia Game Changers Awards, by clicking on the tab and the various project tiles. So we're really looking forward to spending the day with you, and we're delighted that you're making the time to join it and spend with us. So now, Heidi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for the introduction. I do apologise for the technical issues. You do think that perhaps 2 years into a pandemic, we would get our virtual conferencing technology and connection sorted by now, but apparently not. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I had been hoping, after doing the last couple of years virtually, that we would be able to gather in person this year, but I'm full of optimism that next year we'll be able to see each other in person. For those that I haven't met before, I'm Haidi Stroud-Watts from Bloomberg TV, and I'm very happy and proud, as always, to be part of the Asia Society briefing family. Just a point of housekeeping before we get started. We talked a lot about the polling earlier, and this is, of course, a key part of these briefings that we do. it is a fully interactive program. You'll be asked to respond to the poll questions throughout the course of all of our sessions today. You are really encouraged to respond to these questions because they form a very interesting sort of, fundamental basis of these discussions and really get canvass a wide range of views as to what our viewers and some of our members are really thinking at any given point. So you can do that through the Q&A function on your screen. You can also join us on social media with the hashtag Asia Briefing Live across Instagram, of course, Twitter and Facebook if we don't have another outage, of course. Before we get the panel started, I just want to get started with a quick test poll to get you acquainted with the polling platform if you haven't used it before. So the test poll question is Asia at an inflection point in 2021? And you can answer a simple yes or no. Just give a few moments for the answers there to come up. So about halfway through the panel, I'll be bringing up another question for everyone to try and answer as well. But in the meantime, it looks like everything's in order. So let's jump straight in and speak to our esteemed panelists today. Thank you so much for joining us, each and every one of you, and giving us your time. So after spending much of the first part of the global pandemic relatively unscathed by COVID, the lucky country, we have seen in Australia these recent outbreaks of the Delta variant leading to fresh waves of intense lockdowns across the country. And in fact, as we speak, New South Wales is really on the precipice of being able to open up and lift some of these restrictions, having hit that 70% vaccination target as of just yesterday. Regardless, we do still have these lingering questions that remain. COVID continues to affect Australia's globally facing businesses and industries. Should the government be doing more, doing differently to keep Australia open to Asian markets, to Asian capital, to people, labour, talent across certain industries? I want to start off perhaps with the Lord Mayor. As the Lord Mayor of arguably Australia's most international city, you also carry now the mantle of the world's most locked-down city. Now, are you concerned about the long-running, lingering consequences of these lockdowns?
Of course, after such a long time and to be so deeply impacted, these are concerns, but we also feel very confident about our ability to bounce back. We've done it before here in Melbourne, and we feel that the efforts across Australia for us to use the crisis as a catalyst and to make sure that we have very strong momentum as we start to reopen gives us the best chance of really reinstating our status within this region's economy and to make sure that we have ongoing engagement internationally.
To the Vice-Chancellor, of course, one of the biggest sectors to be affected is tertiary education. We still don't have international borders opening, although progress is being made on that front. Even that reopening is likely to be very uneven across states, right? How universities continue to respond to this? And I know with so much learning having gone online, do you see the education model being permanently changed even as things return to normal?
Well, Heidi, at the University of Sydney, we've been struck at the resilience of our international students. They've really stuck with us in a remarkable way and have continued to learn. And I think it shows a number of things. Certainly the quality and engagement of our staff to keep students connected with learning, but also the importance that these international students place on the degrees they're getting from Australian universities and the value that they're extracting from that. Of course, we know that they're desperate to be on campus, and it's been impossible to have many of these international students in the last year or so, but I think there are encouraging signs. The New South Wales government has given a green light to a pilot program to bring in a few plane loads of international students in the next month or two. That's just the beginning of what we hope will be a flood of return of international students. A very significant announcement made last Friday of the recognition of Sinovac, in particular, the vaccine that's been widely used in China and that our Chinese students will have had, to have that recognised by the authorities here, removes another impediment, I think, for the return of international students. So I think we're encouraged that they have stuck with us. We're encouraged that the value of an Australian education still seems to be very strong, but it's been a significant disruption. And I think a challenge for Australia will be the fact that in international markets, the US, the UK and Canada, there has been a real targeting of international students who once may have been coming to Australia. So we'll need to rebuild and rebuild quickly. We'll need to prioritise the return of these students and make sure they quickly can get permission to come back to Australia. I think I was working with the New South Wales government last year before I moved to the University of Sydney. I think it's state governments that understand the extraordinary economic value that international students bring. Not only are they a vital part of our communities, they're a vital part of our casual workforce. They bring significant investment dollars around things like accommodation and tourism, and they are an export powerhouse for us, as well as a soft power and public diplomacy powerhouse. So, we're confident we can rebuild quickly. We need strong support from the federal government to do that. We need a prioritisation of the reinstatement of this market. If all those things can happen, we think we're well positioned for 2022 and beyond.
Chris, for the financial sector, for partnerships within Asia, have you felt an impact? I'm wondering if deal making is that much harder when you can't be in the same room, when you can't discuss things face to face?
Yeah, Heidi, really interesting question. For our business at La Trobe Financial, the lockdowns and border closures slowed inflows somewhat, but we still grew by 28%, net monthly inflows of 200 million. So it's still been a really prospective time for us and a constructive time for us as a business. But your point is right. Business is a contact sport. The longer we're in it, the more we're convinced that business is all about those personal relationships between people based on trust. If we're all living in our little isolated cells, our Shangri-Las or what have you, we lose that human contact and intimacy. You can't build that over Zoom. You can't build that over platforms, tech, even if you're not having tech troubles. So all of that increases the risk of misunderstandings at a geopolitical level, and at a business level, it's really difficult to build those relationships of trust. Now, we've been as a nation drawing down, if you like, on what you could call the goodwill capital that we've accumulated over the last 3 decades internationally. We're doing that now, but that account is finite and it will be exhausted sooner than we expect. So, it was really interesting to hear Mark's comments on education, and there's some hope there. But students can find other countries to study in. Travellers will explore, tourists will explore new regions. Migrants will switch to North America or Europe. Our staff in Asia, we've got offices in Hong Kong and Shanghai, they're telling us what we already know. There's a whole range of things that could happen from here, and the one thing that we can be certain of is that there's no version of the future in which Australia can remain prosperous, but also indefinitely isolated from our regional and global partners. So reopening physical borders is a key priority for us as a nation.
Raina, we talk a lot about the public health aspects of everything that's going on, and actually I haven't spoken to you since the sort of pivot to reopening. Is there a way that we can reopen the economy, both domestically and internationally, in a safe way that is a good story for public health systems, particularly if we see it plateauing when it comes to vaccination rates?
There is, but we have to use the vaccine plus and ventilation strategy. It's very clear from around the world that vaccine alone strategy is not enough. I mean, we're seeing Singapore struggling at the moment, despite very high vaccination rates. But in some European countries where they've actually embraced that more holistic approach, they're seeing cases going right down. So where you address safe indoor air, it has to be part of the strategy. You keep the mask mandates going so people can get about and move around and mix more freely without the risk of infection. So really, until we get either vaccines that are better matched to the variants that we're facing, such as Delta, or we have the boosters, we don't know what difference the boosters will make. We do need to rely on some other measures, and we need to keep the testing and the tracing going. Otherwise, we'll just be in a cycle of perpetual lockdowns when the health system collapses. And to avoid that, it's really important that we embrace all those other things. The thing that's been really missing in Australia is the safe indoor air.
That those safe indoor settings are critical for you, Matt, in your business, right? In gaming and in casinos and tourism. Is the business well prepared to open up? What does the return to normalcy look like for you?
Well, Heidi, as you know, we've become all way too good at managing to public health orders. And as we've just heard, safe indoor air is one of the topics. You know, we're now installing air filters and filtration systems that we've never even thought about years ago. But, you know, I'm probably as the sort of resident Euro here, on the more positive end of the spectrum. You know, we've done a fair bit of research into attitudes in Asia and particularly in China. And we think that the market is about to come back. As soon as the borders open, behaviors will go back to what they used to be. The fundamental attractiveness of Australia as a tourism destination hasn't changed. And as you know, we've got 6 hotels under construction that will open up over the next 18 to 24 months. I'm absolutely convinced that those hotels will be loaded up with inbound traffic from Asia as soon as the borders open up. Our research says Australia continues to be attractive, not just as a tourism destination, but also as an education destination. So if we do everything we can, not just with vaccination, but also with all the auxiliary tools that we have now developed, we'll be doing well.
On that point, I think it's a good time to bring our polling question. The question is, which country in the region presents now the biggest opportunity for Australian business? Of course, this taking into account the bilateral tensions between Australia and our biggest trading partner, China, which have just steadily built over the past few years, as well as the rise and the sort of coping mechanisms that we've seen across Southeast Asia economically across the course of this pandemic. So if you want to pop in your answers now, we'll have a look at some of those results. And we are seeing actually Indonesia coming in at 36%. China very much falling behind now. But we are across those results still. So very interesting. We're seeing Indonesia followed very closely by, in fact, neck and neck with India now, and a bit of a slowdown when it comes to China. Very interestingly, very few of you seem to identify opportunities for Australia in the Japanese and Korean markets, despite what we've seen in financial markets. Chris, this is interesting to me from a financial markets perspective. Do you feel like, given that markets have largely shrugged off the Delta variant, traded off central bank policy and liquidity conditions, does that mean the reopening bounce has largely been priced in as well?
Well, markets have priced in the recovery, Heidi. I agree with that, and they are looking on a sort of a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis as to the timing of COVID and the rollout from here. The central banks ahead of them have a fine balancing act, and that's as to what they're going to do with quantitative easing and rate normalisation. In our view, rates will remain lower. They will remain lower for longer. In our view, bond and equity markets are going to have adjustment points, but our expectation really is that the financial economy is sort of trying to track what's going on in the world with lockdowns. So we come back to this fundamental priority: reopening our nation, reopening the world to global trade, reopening the world physically, reopening the world in every way. That's got to be a priority of governments across the world, and it's a particularly pointed priority here in Australia as a export-oriented trading nation. We're not going to change that setting. We need migrants to fill a range of jobs that our native population simply can't fill. We've had net migration levels of around 280,000 a year for the last decade. That's now zero for perhaps 3 years. $40 billion hole per annum in our economy just from missing international students. So at every level, the success of our economy and the global economy over the next decade depends on reopening physical borders, reopening trade, and we think governments here in Australia and internationally get that.
And potentially rebalancing as well, right, in terms of our top trading partner, in terms of the opportunities across the region. And Vice-Chancellor, this kind of goes to the heart of your business. Is there too much reliance on Chinese students, on the education sector there, particularly with all of the regulatory headwinds that we see in China? Are you seeing a transition to look to other sources of business?
Well, look, I think it's a challenging environment with China, of course, but I think we've got to take a longer-term view on this. There's been a clear bipartisan policy in Australia for 2 decades now to increase the number of international students, and that has been an extraordinary success. It's allowed the federal government to reduce its contribution to the funding of universities and allowed the benefits of the income stream that international students have brought to put a massive subsidy into Australian research investment and also to improve the facilities at universities that have been available to domestic students and international students. So it's been a clear bipartisan policy and it has worked to a very considerable degree. Now, there is a disproportionate number of Chinese students as part of our mix of international students, but that needs to be looked at the context of the market. China sends students abroad a year. It's a vast international student market. It's double the size of the international student market that comes from India, and it's 10 times the size of any other market in the region. So it's dominant. And as far as Australia is concerned, you know, China, we know it makes up 20% of the world's population. It accounts for a quarter of our total trade in goods and services. So China will always be a massive market as far as international students are concerned. And the Chinese government understands the value of international education, particularly as their own universities come up to world-class level, and they're still wanting that international experience for their rising leaders across government, all across China. So China will remain important, but I think there is a rebalancing that all universities understand that we need to make. We want to grow that Indian market. I was talking to Barry O'Farrell, the Consul General there in recent times, the High Commissioner in India. He is driving the growth of India as a market for Australian universities. We also see good opportunities in Vietnam, Indonesia, and a range of other countries in the region. So China is important. It will remain very, very important part of the mix. But yes, we would like to rebalance the portfolio somewhat, and I think all Australian universities are looking to focus on that in the years ahead.
Matt, does anyone replace the demographic spending power of the Chinese consumer for your business? Because even as we open up international borders, China remains pretty much the last country still sticking to COVID zero. I don't see, a time in the near term where we would see that return of leisure travellers back and forth.
I'm again probably a lot more optimistic than you are. Look, I can only echo what Mark was saying. China in tourism and outbound travel is the largest market by far, the most mature market, and represents the market that we would need to build our business on. Diversification is a good thing. It's a good thing in any business, and in the short term, yes, we saw particularly in the last few years before the pandemic, the good growth out of Southeast Asia, inbound traffic, particularly at the higher end of the luxury traveler, and we will continue to pursue that market. But in the long term, we will have to rely on China, and as I said, I'm absolutely bullish that will happen. Now, in our business, it sort of doesn't come to a year or two. We have licenses that go for 100 years or perpetuity. We have assets that last hundreds of years. So, I'm absolutely convinced that we're doing the right thing by continuing to work on the Chinese market.
Lord Mayor, there is work to be done when it comes to increasing engagement, not just with our Chinese partners, but within Asia. What's the strategy then to bring up that engagement in the post-COVID or post-COVID recovery era?
Yeah, Heidi, I think we often forget that even though we've been in lockdown really as a nation, there's been so much work that's been ongoing. One of our biggest markets, of course, is international students. We've had across our universities ongoing engagement through online learning, and we've also needed to remind ourselves that many international students actually stayed here in Australia during this period And certainly as a city, we've been very involved from support at one side, even with things like food vouchers and mental health support, through to making sure that they still feel that their education experience here in Melbourne has been worthwhile through other programs such as work experience, even though it's had to be online. And I think we need to remember that even as we start to open up, there's going to be a long period where there are limitations and restrictions on travel, and it's important that we continue to do our best to find ways to engage, as we have, for example, with our sister cities and other cities across China, Japan, Indonesia in particular. We've been having innovation hubs and hackathons. We've been having presentations across centres of excellence and industry groups to be able to maintain those sorts of relationships, with the very strong appreciation for the fact that markets in Asia are absolutely vital for us now, and the way that we continue to nurture those has a really big impact on how quickly we can spring back and hopefully then exceed our engagement into the future. For me particularly, Heidi, I think of stats like the Asian market represents 36% of the world's unicorns, 50% of the world's R&D spend. Very important markets for us here in Melbourne as a knowledge city, as a city that really wants to do more around commercialisation. That's really just one example, but I really want to acknowledge that the work that's been happening to engage during this lockdown period, I hope, is what's going to set us up well on a positive trajectory as we start to reopen again.
And I think that thriving, such a big part of that is being able to attract and retain talent, right? Raina, my question to you is obviously that the flow of people, the flow of labour, the lack of skilled migrants has been a big part of the structural kind of deficit of this pandemic. What needs to happen to be able to see a safe return of skilled migration?
Well, we need to work on the vaccine passports, obviously, and particularly accepting vaccines that are not used in Australia. We need to do that rapidly and get that all sorted out. We need to have a quarantine system which will, I think we will, ideally we would have a quarantine system, but the scale would have to be much greater than it is now to allow much more people to move in and out of the borders. And that's because there could be new variants arising. And, when you look at the kind of quarantine system China's put in and the investment they've made, it's pretty phenomenal. Hong Kong also has a really good quarantine system that they've developed during the pandemic. So I think we can look at some of those other models and take the best of different models. The other issue is, again, booster vaccines. I think for the protection of the population, we have to actually be agile and pivot quickly with the evidence. Australia has probably been a bit slow off the mark. It's abundantly clear that we're going to need boosters. The vaccines start to wane by 5 to 6 months. And if we don't pivot quickly and get people protected, we have to protect people so that we can get the borders open and have that traffic of people in and out. All of those things will serve our national interest better.
Raina, just want to follow up. Does that mean even with a pilot of potentially at-home quarantine for some travellers, you would still be advocating for hotel-style quarantine for other types of travellers, business travellers from overseas, for example?
It really depends on how the vaccine passport system works. I think the two need to be integrated. It is absolutely clear that some vaccines are better than others. It's also a matter of how many doses you've had. Have you had 2 doses or 3? All of those things will make a difference, and it's going to become very apparent as time goes on. And I think countries that are proactive and address it earlier rather than later will do better. Because what we want to avoid is the cycle of lockdowns. And the reason that cycle of lockdowns happens is that if you don't manage it well and keep the population reasonably well protected, then the cases start to surge, and it could even be in vaccinated people that you start seeing cases. We're certainly seeing that in other countries, so the majority of cases are still in unvaccinated. You'll stress the health system to a point where the lockdown is forced, and we've seen that happen everywhere around the world despite the best intentions. So to really avoid that, it does need a very layered approach of, looking at all the different points at which you can make a difference and reduce that risk and reduce the need for repeated lockdowns.
Chris, in terms of the investment world, we've seen the pandemic really spur a number of these post-pandemic themes, like the transition to e-commerce, the transition to hybrid working, what it means for the future of the workforce. Which of these themes do you think will stick? Which investment themes do you think will kind of truly be structurally changing the world going forward?
Heidi, there's going to be a legacy. E-commerce here in Australia probably got a 12-year shot in the arm, if you like, from COVID and what that meant for people's shopping habits. That's not going to go away. There'll be, if you like, a relief rally. People who've been in lockdown for a long time are finding even a trip to the supermarket to be a source of great entertainment and amusement, but that won't last forever. Habits have changed. People who had never tried e-commerce, who'd never tried shopping for clothes online, have been forced into that situation, and that's going to change habits. So for businesses, for markets, the challenge is to capture those sort of thematics in a way that's enduring. So, yes, there will be more e-commerce. We are going to probably see a move for some time to flexible work, although our view here is that at some point people are going to realise the value of the interchange of ideas, the social interactions, the learning that you get from sitting next to people in the same office. So we don't think the office is dead, as some are positing, but there will be some flexibility in the way people approach their work practices into the future. And for investors, for equity investors in particular, there's a whole range of thematics that are going to capture those sorts of trends. So, if we're smart as a population, if we get our regulatory settings right, they say never waste a crisis. There are opportunities for us as a nation to come out stronger at the end of this. And remember, bolstering that will be that massive $230 billion in additional household savings that will be sitting with the banks here in Australia by the end of the year. That's a real cushion for investors wondering what's going to happen with consumer spending over the next 12 to 24 months.
There's only so much disposable spending that you can do at the post office or supermarket, right? Matt, the other big headwind really for your business or for tourism is not just, I suppose, a lack of Chinese consumers and visitors being able to come into the country, but the ongoing regulatory crackdowns is focused on common prosperity. Does that make you re-strategize about what sort of products and services and offerings you make to that Chinese consumer?
Look, the regulatory focus on particularly anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, we welcome that. That's a good thing. Nobody wants to do business with people like that. Our focus is very much on the premium mass tourism luxury segment of the market. And, that segment, a bit like what Mark just referenced, there's significant savings that have been building up. People are waiting for experiences. And as soon as the experiences become available, they'll get onto the planes and go and travel. We just have to be realistic about what the offer is. If the average business trip to Australia is 2 days, we can't put people into quarantine for a week if you want them to come and do business here. The typical international tourist from Asia spends 1 week in Australia, does 3 cities, and spends 1 week. We can't ask them to do 2 weeks of quarantine on the way in. So once we've got that sorted, our offering, I'm sure, will be well received.
Lord Mayor, in terms of Melbourne's position, I wonder if you've talked to some of your colleagues across the rest of Australia, because one of the big thematics that is emerging is this idea of a multi-speed recovery or a multi-speed reopening up, where, you know, potentially you will have the ability to fly in and out internationally out of Victoria, out of New South Wales, but you won't be able to go and, you know, see friends and relatives in other parts of the country. Does this unevenness concern you in terms of the broader growth and recovery story?
Yes, and Heidi, we keep in touch through the Council of Capital City Lord Mayors. We catch up regularly as mayors of really the biggest economies in Australia. And it is a worry because even though we're an enormous country by landmass, we're a tiny country by population, and our market relatively is therefore smaller and quite challenging. So we need to know for international business and international visitors, but particularly international business, that we have a high functioning national market to be able to attract them and keep them. Same for talent, to be able to feel that they can realise their career potential, to be able to move around Australia and take advantage of all of the opportunities on offer. So we are very keen to see those interstate borders open, to have, as I said, a high-functioning national economy as we start to reopen into the international markets. It's absolutely critical. The capital cities represent about 80% of the nation's GDP and also 80% of our population, and it's important that all of those resources and that talent is able to move around effectively and efficiently for us to have that best step back into international markets.
Raina, do you think we should see states holding on to that COVID zero status when we see other states essentially adopting, you know, live with COVID, live with Delta going forward?
I think, the concept of live with COVID is misunderstood. It's never going to be an endemic disease. You can't control how much of it you'd like there to be. It'll be more like measles, where if it's there, it'll find the unvaccinated pockets or communities and cause epidemics. And it hasn't mutated into cold. It's actually mutated to become more deadly and more contagious. So, it's going to be a serious infection that's around, and I think every state will have to look at controlling it. I don't think it's feasible for states to remain entirely COVID-free into the long term, but I do think there's a lot of hope for better vaccines, better vaccination strategies, whether it's boosters or Delta-matched boosters. I actually think we can achieve much better control than we have today. What we have today is not what we're going to have tomorrow. The vaccine pipeline is very dynamic and it's going to change very rapidly. What we need is policy that's agile and responsive to the evidence so that we can, pivot and make the changes we need policy-wise for vaccines to make sure that we can have the best possible life that is available to us with the choices that we have. And that means, speeding up with the booster recommendations. At the moment, that's kind of on ice when it's abundantly clear that we're going to need boosters. Those are all the kind of things that will make it more feasible to have all the borders open.
The incredible developments in the vaccine pipeline, also treatments as well. We've had recent really encouraging data from Merck, for example, about their treatment drug. A lot of vaccine hesitant people would say it is exactly that remarkable pace of development that worries them, right? How do you get past that final hurdle of vaccine hesitancy, particularly if we try and put in that missing puzzle piece of getting children vaccinated?
I don't think there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Australia. We have a very vaccine accepting culture. Unfortunately, with all the kind of toing and froing and changing recommendations that happened through the course of this year, we probably created some hesitancy, but I think at the core, Australians are very accepting of public health measures and vaccines, and I'm pretty sure we'll end up one of the most highly vaccinated countries in the world, and we've got to keep, pursuing that goal. I think we can get there. I think we can achieve 90% of the whole population vaccinated, and vaccine hesitancy, the lessons from vaccine hesitancy across the decades is that if people are truly vaccine objectors, that's only about 2% of the population, there's no point trying to change their mind. You really have to focus on the people who are unsure, where there is some room to change them. And again, we need to look at multicultural strategies as well. There's particular communities who don't trust the government, they don't trust vaccines, and so we need to do a quite diverse work in terms of working with those communities, but I think we can get to very high vaccination rates.
Vice-Chancellor, have you given thought about vaccine mandates as in-person learning, as potentially international students return as well?
Yeah, we're looking at it closely, and universities around Australia are looking at it closely. Our initial data suggests surveys of staff that will be well in excess of 90% vaccinated amongst our staff. Students have been slower, but then the vaccine was slower to roll out amongst young people. But as Raina suggested, we're expecting very high uptake. And then I think the question for us all is, what are the appropriate policy settings? And there might be some conflict here. I think some of the experts like Raina and Julie Lease from the University of Sydney have suggested that mandating might move some people who were ambivalent into an anti-status. They don't like being told what to do. They're somewhat distrustful of government authority. And some of those who are in the balance might move to the no side, and that's not beneficial. But on the other hand, what we've got to do is we've got to create as safe an environment as we can and provide reassurance and security for the staff and students who are visiting the campus each day. We know overwhelmingly the in-person experience is vital for quality teaching and learning. We know that our students are desperate to get back. So we want to be in an environment where we are providing peace of mind and security. And so that's one of the reasons we'd think carefully about a vaccine mandate. We're following the public health orders as that they apply now. Universities around Australia are considering, and I think we'll see some policy positions taken by universities across different states and possibly even across the country in the next month or so.
Vice-Chancellor, I'll end with you. I grew up in Melbourne and my family's there, and I know it's a city that has always embraced change, has always had this very international leaning image. Do you think the pandemic can force long-term structural change for the Australian economy, or is it something where we see a return to normal and a lot of the, disruption and enthusiasm for change that we saw early on in the pandemic will just fall by the wayside?
No, I think we'll look back on this as a clear turning point, and I'd agree with the other speakers. When I was running the New South Wales education system last year, we agreed we had 10 years of transformation in 10 weeks, particularly around the application of technology. And I think it's the same in the university sector as well. We know that technology has been an important way to transform teaching and learning, but now the critical question is, now things get back to normal, how do we keep and hold on to the insights that we have gained to use the time together in a different way and to use the technology in a more powerful way? I think we've seen it with online shopping and online retail, as we've heard earlier, in a range of ways. I suspect we're not going to go back. I suspect that many organisations like universities and schools and retailers and others are going to take advantage to lock in the great step forward, particularly around the application of technology that we've seen. So I don't think you can go back. The world is now different. We have seen that carefully and we have felt it in our lives, and I think now leaders will take to look to lock in those advantages and those insights and drive the transformation to improve services and improve service delivery, and certainly in education to improve the quality of teaching and learning on offer for everyone.
And Lord Mayor, finally, do you think we'll see a refresh for Melbourne?
Definitely. I'm old enough to remember the financial crisis in the late 80s, early 90s, when we were described as a moribund city in a rust bucket state, Heidi. We went on to become one of the most livable cities in the world, and that came from concerted effort and really using the disconnect to be deliberate about a better way forward. That's certainly what we've got planned for Melbourne post-COVID, and it should be different, and different can be good.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and I look forward to seeing all of you in person soon, hopefully. Sally Capp, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne there, Mark Scott, Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sydney, of course also Raina MacIntyre, Professor of Global Biosecurity and National Health and Medical Research Council Principal Research Fellow from the University of New South Wales. Matt Bekier, great to have you too, a Managing Director and CEO at The Star, and of course, finally, Chris Andrews, Deputy CEO and Chief Investment Officer at La Trobe Financial. So that brings to a close our first session today. Of course, many more interesting sessions and briefings to come in the course of the day. We will be streaming live all day. I, of course, encourage you to join our next public panel session. That's China, the US and us. We're back here at 10:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Time, and our first VIP briefing on the road to COP26 as well, as the drumbeat starts counting down to Glasgow. That will also begin in about 45 minutes. You can get details on access in your inboxes as well, with all those VIP sessions to be delivered on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us.